The Bad Batch is not unfinished because it lacks plot, but because it has deliberately opened wounds it has not yet allowed to heal. From its earliest episodes, the series establishes clone identity as a crisis rather than a quirk. These soldiers are not merely adjusting to a new regime, but discovering that the purpose they were engineered for has expired. That existential displacement is introduced with care, but never fully explored to its natural emotional depth. The story pauses repeatedly just before the consequences become irreversible. The fall of the Republic does not simply end a war, it invalidates an entire population. The clones were built to serve a system that no longer exists and are now expected to vanish quietly into irrelevance. The show acknowledges this reality through background dialogue and fleeting encounters, but stops short of inhabiting it fully. We glimpse the fear, confusion, and denial, but rarely sit with it long enough to let it harden into truth. That restraint suggests not completion, but delay. Clone decommissioning is one of the most devastating concepts Star Wars has ever introduced, and the Bad Batch treats it as an ambient threat rather than a central trauma. Soldiers are dismissed, reassigned, or erased with bureaucratic indifference. These moments are framed as plot mechanics rather than lived experiences. We are shown what happens, but not what it feels like to survive it day after day. That emotional gap remains wide open. Forced retirement is not simply the loss of a job for the clones, but the collapse of identity. They were never taught how to exist outside obedience, and now obedience has no place for them. The series hints at this through veterans clinging to routine or loyalty long after it is rewarded. Yet the psychological cost of this conditioning is only briefly touched before the narrative moves on. There is still an entire interior world left unexplored. Disappearance is the quiet horror that haunts every clone-focused story. Some are reassigned, others are decommissioned, and many simply vanish without explanation. The Bad Batch acknowledges this pattern, but has not yet traced its ripple effects. What happens to the clones who survive but are forgotten? How do communities respond when entire populations fade away? These questions linger unanswered. Omega's presence complicates this unresolved terrain in ways the series has only begun to address. She's not just a companion or moral anchor, but a living variable in the future of cloning itself. Her genetic significance is teased repeatedly without being resolved. The long-term implications of her existence remain deliberately obscured. That mystery feels less like closure deferred and more like a story still forming. Omega also represents a different relationship to clone identity than anything Star Wars has shown before. She is not a soldier discovering freedom after service, but a child growing into autonomy without ever having been conscripted. Her perspective offers a mirror to the clones rather than a repetition of their experience. The show has only begun to explore what that contrast means. Her impact on their understanding of themselves is still unfolding. The early Empire era is one of the most psychologically rich and morally unstable periods in the entire timeline. Power is consolidating but not yet normalized. Fear is present but not yet ritualized. The Bad Batch operates directly inside this uncertainty rather than around it. That positioning is rare and incredibly valuable. It creates opportunities for grounded storytelling that other series simply cannot access. This era allows the show to depict oppression before it becomes mythologized. The Empire is still experimenting, still testing, still learning how to control. The consequences of these experiments fall disproportionately on clones. The series hints at this systemic cruelty, but often pulls away before fully committing to its implications. That hesitation suggests unfinished business rather than restraint. The squad itself remains in flux in ways that feel intentional rather than resolved. Loyalty is no longer automatic, and purpose is no longer obvious. Survival replaces victory as the primary objective. These dynamics are introduced early, but have not yet reached their breaking point. The team has adapted but has not yet transformed. Missions still provide structure, but they increasingly feel like excuses to delay the inevitable reckoning. Each job buys time rather than direction. This is narratively effective, but only if it leads somewhere definitive. The longer the series continues without confronting that stasis, the more incomplete it feels. The tension demands release, not repetition. What makes the Bad Batch compelling is that it understands the cost of loyalty without a cause. These characters are not rebelling to win a war, but to preserve their humanity. That is a quieter, more fragile struggle. The series has treated this with respect, but not finality. The story still owes these characters an answer. The emotional terrain between brotherhood and obsolescence has only been mapped in outline. We have seen moments of doubt, flashes of anger, and brief attempts at reinvention. What we have not seen is sustained consequence. Choices have not yet closed doors permanently. That absence keeps the narrative open rather than complete. Clone-centric storytelling in Star Wars has always ended abruptly. The Clone Wars ended with a switch flipped and an order executed. The Bad Batch was the first attempt to stay with the aftermath. Ending it prematurely would repeat the same erasure it is trying to critique. Completion requires endurance. The series does not feel unfinished because it lacks ideas, but because it has honoured them enough to stop short of resolution. It has identified the wounds but has not yet allowed them to scar. That restraint only works if the story continues long enough to earn its silence. Right now, the Bad Batch is not complete. It is waiting. What additional seasons of the Bad Batch could accomplish is not escalation but completion. The story does not need a larger enemy or higher stakes because the stakes are already existential. The clones are confronting the collapse of purpose itself, and that is a conflict that cannot be resolved quickly or cleanly. Time is the necessary ingredient, and time is what the series has deliberately asked for. Without it, the story risks ending in the same silence it was created to challenge. The moral collapse of the clone army is one of the darkest arcs Star Wars has ever positioned itself to tell, and no other show is equipped to handle it with this level of intimacy. These soldiers were engineered for loyalty and rewarded for obedience, and now that obedience is being weaponized against them. Additional seasons could follow this collapse, not as a single event, but as a drawn-out erosion. Trust breaks slowly, and identity fractures unevenly. Watching that process unfold is the point. Unlike stories driven by prophecy or destiny, this narrative is grounded in conditioning and consequence. Clones do not suddenly awaken to freedom, they stumble toward it, unevenly and often too late. Some cling to the system because it is all they know. Others reject it and find themselves lost without structure. A longer arc allows these divergent paths to coexist rather than be simplified. Complexity requires duration. The show is uniquely positioned to bridge the emotional gap between the end of the Clone Wars and the normalized cruelty of the Empire. That gap is often skipped because it is uncomfortable. The Bad Batch lives inside that discomfort. The Empire is not yet mythic, but procedural. Its horrors are mundane and bureaucratic. More seasons could chart how that normalcy settles in, and how people learn to survive within it, rather than resist it heroically. This approach avoids the need for Jedi or Sith to carry narrative weight. The Force does not need to intervene for the story to matter. The stakes are human and immediate. Decisions are small but cumulative. Survival often requires compromise rather than victory. This grounded perspective is rare in Star Wars and should not be rushed to conclusion. Its value lies in patience. The series also has the freedom to commit to darker, slower storytelling that animation rarely sustains long term. Loss can linger without being reversed. Trauma can shape behaviour rather than resolve into lessons. Choices can narrow futures instead of opening them. This tone distinguishes the Bad Batch from other animated projects, and additional seasons could lean into that distinction rather than soften it. Darkness here is not aesthetic, it is experiential. Crosshair's trajectory alone warrants further exploration, not because it needs redemption, but because it resists easy categorization. His loyalty, his defiance, and his isolation expose the psychological cost of conditioning more clearly than any speech could. A longer story allows his choices to matter without being rushed toward absolution. Some paths end without forgiveness, and that truth deserves space. Omega's arc likewise requires time to reach meaning. Her importance is not in what she becomes, but in how she changes those around her. She represents a future that the clones will never inhabit fully. Watching her grow while they fade is a quiet tragedy that cannot be rushed without losing its impact. Her unresolved place in the timeline is not a flaw, but a promise. Closure here should be earned, not imposed. Additional seasons would also allow the series to explore clone perspectives beyond the central squad. Former comrade civilians turned administrators and soldiers turned enforcers, all represent different responses to the same betrayal. Expanding these viewpoints would transform the story from a single survival narrative into a collective reckoning. The clone army deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote. Ending clone-centric storytelling properly matters because it corrects a long-standing omission in Star Wars. The clones were instrumental to the Republic's fall, yet were discarded once their narrative function was fulfilled. The Bad Batch began the work of staying with them afterward. Ending that work prematurely would repeat the same erasure. Completion here is an ethical choice as much as a narrative one. More seasons would not dilute the series, because dilution comes from repetition without consequence. What remains unexplored is consequence itself. Permanent loss, irreversible decisions, and final reckonings have been deferred, not avoided. The story still has places to go that cannot be revisited, once past. That forward momentum is intact. It only needs room to reach its end. The Bad Batch does not need to last forever, but it does need to finish. Its themes demand an ending shaped by weariness, acceptance, and hard-earned clarity. That ending cannot arrive abruptly, without undermining everything that came before it. Closure here should feel heavy, not triumphant. Silence should feel earned, not imposed. What makes this story special is its refusal to treat survival as victory. The clones are not saving the galaxy, they are trying to remain themselves inside a system designed to erase them. That is one of the most human stories Star Wars has ever told. Human stories require patience. They unfold slowly and end quietly. Anything less would feel dishonest.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.